Thank you, everybody, for coming here today. I will do a short intro for Robert Wright. So Robert Wright is a journalist, scholar, and prize-winning author of best-selling books about science, evolutionary psychology, history, religion, and game theory. Robert Wright also taught at Princeton University about connection between modern cognitive science and Buddhism. Professor Wright famously explained in his book, The Moral Animal, how evolution shapes our human brain and how our mind is designed to create delusion about ourselves and about our world. So our mind is designed to make happiness hard to sustain. So how do we sustain happiness? So today, Professor Wright finds that answer in the 2,500 years old teachings by Shakyamuni Buddha, a prince from the great land of India. In his latest bestseller book, Why Buddhism Is True, he leads on a journey through psychology, philosophy, and Buddha's teaching to show how and why meditation can serve as the foundation for a spiritual life in a secular age. Meditation can make us a better and happier human being. So I introduce you to Professor Wright, and please note that we have 15 minutes for Q&A and book signing. So if you have any questions, please wait until the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Sonam. And thank you for all the work you did to make this possible. And thank you all for coming. I'm almost surprised these days when anybody shows up for a talk on Buddhism because the political situation in America is so distracting and engrossing that a lot of people have trouble thinking about anything else. Of course, there is one connection between meditation and the political situation. Some people are using meditation as a kind of refuge, you know, kind of to establish an island of calm amid all the stuff. I think there's actually a second kind of connection. I think mindfulness meditation in particular can, in a subtle way, play a productive role here in kind of contemporary politics. And I want to talk about that a little at the end if I have time. But first, I want to talk about the book a little, give you a basic idea of what it's about. And I think I pretty much have to start by addressing the title, Why Buddhism Is True. In fact, I'm going to ask for a show of hands. Try to be honest. This won't offend me. How many of you, when you see the title or first saw the title, found it a little obnoxious or off-putting? Okay. All right, you can leave now. No.
The answer is yes.
No, it's a totally defensible reaction. And so it is incumbent on me to try to convince you that, that the title is justified. So for starters, what part of Buddhism am I talking about? I'm talking about what you might call the naturalistic part. I'm not getting into like, reincarnation and so on. Talking about the parts that are amenable to examination via modern psychology, modern philosophy, and that's the kind of examination I do in the book. If you ask what in particular am I saying is true, there's a number of answers to that, but one thing I'd say is that the core of Buddhism is the claim that the reason we suffer and the reason we make other people suffer is because we don't see the world clearly, okay? We don't see ourselves clearly, we don't see other people clearly. As a result, we suffer needlessly and we behave badly towards other people. When you think about it, that's kind of an amazing claim, right? The idea, because it suggests that by clarifying your vision, by pursuing truth, you could make yourself happier and make yourself a better person. So the idea is that kind of truth and goodness and happiness can in principle converge. So you can kind of kill three birds with one stone, you might say, which is nice, you know, convenient. And of course, Buddhism provides the stone. It provides a whole set of teachings and practice that are intended to clarify your vision and have these very welcome consequences of that. The practice includes meditation, and I focus a lot on that in the book. I talk about mindfulness meditation in particular. I'm sure all of you either do it or have heard of it. Needs no introduction these days. I think a lot of people think of mindfulness meditation as basically therapeutic. They think of it as, for stress reduction or dealing with anxiety, and it can do those things. But I think what's lost is that there really is a connection between mindfulness meditation and kind of the depths of Buddhist philosophy, really deep issues in Buddhist philosophy. And I think people who are doing mindfulness meditation in a kind of therapeutic way are closer than they realize to really serious philosophical and spiritual exploration. And in the book, I try to provide some of the background that will help them make that connection. Now, obviously, I'm not the first person to say that Buddhism is true. Many people have said it. Buddhists, for example, have been saying it for 2,500 years. Obviously, the premise of this title is that I have something new to say about that, and you might ask, who am I to claim that I have something new to say about a subject that's been so discussed for so long? The good news is I don't claim that I had some special meditative revelation that I'm going to share with you. In fact, one difference between this book and a lot of books that get into Buddhist meditation is this book is not by someone who's especially good at meditating. Many of them are by people who are very good at meditating. Meditation didn't come naturally to me. I finally had to go to a retreat to see enough benefits for me to really make it a practice. I've been on a number of retreats now, and on retreat in particular, I have had some experiences that seem, kind of deep. But I'm not one of these adepts who kind of have these experiences on a more regular basis, or even kind of, in a sense, walk around in daily life with the benefit of these of radically different apprehensions of the world. But I did interview a lot of these people, and so their voices are heard in the book, and so I hope that helps my my exposition and my argument. But still, I did not come down from a mountaintop with any kind of special illumination. You will be happy to hear. What I'm arguing is that there is a kind of illumination of the logic behind Buddhist philosophy and psychology that is available now that just wasn't available 40, 50 years ago. And it's modern psychology, and in particular, evolutionary psychology, which is the study of how natural selection designed, so to speak, in quotes, designed the human mind. Now, I wrote a book about evolutionary psychology a long time ago called The Moral Animal. And one thing I realized when I wrote that, I realized a couple of things that in retrospect have real connections to Buddhism, and I emphasized them in the book. One is that people are not designed to be happy, okay? Natural selection, that's not high on natural selection's agenda. The bottom line for natural selection is getting genes into the next generation. Traits that get genes into the next generation are the traits that flourish, period. Whether they make you happy, sad, whatever. And that seems to explain why, as some of you probably noticed, gratification tends to evaporate, right? You eat some food, you have some sex, whatever. Before long, the thrill fades and you wouldn't mind having some more, right? Now, that makes sense from the point of view of natural selection, right? Because if you imagine animals that were eternally contented, if they ate one meal and just sat there and, wow, that was great, and didn't seek any more food, well, they wouldn't do well, right? And so too with sex. I mean, from natural selection's point of view, more sex is better. I mean, more chances to reproduce are better. So you wouldn't want someone to just bask in the afterglow forever after a single sexual episode. This is consistent with one thing that the Buddha emphasized, which is that there is a lot of suffering in life as ordinarily lived. And in fact, this very phenomenon is emphasized in Buddhism, the fleetingness of pleasure. And in fact, the word that is translated as suffering, dukkha, a lot of people think that a good translation of that might be unsatisfactoriness. And that certainly meshes very well with a kind of evolutionary perspective. It's unsatisfactoriness that you would expect natural selection to build into us, to want us to always want a little more, to be discontented. Now, I said that Buddhism emphasizes our failure to see things clearly, and you kind of see that here in the fleetingness of pleasure, because when we look forward to pleasure, we tend to look forward to the pleasure and not focus on the fact that it will evaporate, right? It's a kind of an unbalanced view, that If you're thinking about eating some junk food, you're thinking about the taste of the junk food, not that, maybe half an hour later you'll be restless. If there's some promotion you've been gunning for, you're focusing on the benefits it'll bring, not the headaches. That's just kind of natural, and you could say that that's, if not an illusion, a departure from, kind of perfect balance of vision. Now, you might say, well, that's not quite a misperception, it's just an unbalanced perception, and that's true. And you might also say, look, by and large, people do a very good job of perceiving things clearly. They don't run into walls, they have very good navigational equipment. That's true, but even in that realm, that simple pedestrian realm of just perceiving objects, you do see a kind of illusion built into it. So people tend to overestimate the speed at which large objects approach. Now, you can see why that would make sense. There's no way of knowing for sure that that's built by natural selection, but it surely makes sense, right? Because it's better safe than sorry. Better to get out of the way, animal or whatever, too soon than too late. So, and I say that just to make the point that, strictly speaking, just as our happiness is not high on a natural selection's agenda, strictly speaking, accuracy of perception is not. If inaccuracy of perception, if illusion will get genes into the next generation, then that can be favored by natural selection. And in this realm of kind of better safe than sorry, the thing the principle that leads you to overestimate the speed of an object, you kind of see how these two things, illusion and suffering, can again kind of coincide. So if you're like walking through, taking a hike, and you've heard that there are rattlesnakes all over, every time you hear a rustling, you're going to kind of imagine that there's a snake there. You might, if a lizard darts across, you're probably going to think it's a snake for a while. That's an illusion. It's also unpleasant. It's suffering. But from natural selection's point of view, and maybe even from yours, all those false positives are worth it. But the point is, again, suffering, illusion, they can make sense from natural selection's point of view. And then, on top of that, living in an environment that natural selection did not prepare us for compounds things. So you take forms of suffering that are, in a sense, natural, like anxiety, and they morph into whole new, difficult to manage forms. So, for example, evolutionary psychologists would say that having anxiety about a toddler is natural. If it's your toddler and they wander off, you'll go, wait, something horrible has happened, run after them. But natural selection didn't equip us for, say, dropping a toddler off at a daycare center on the first day where you don't know anybody at the daycare center. And so that's going to just totally freak people out, right? Or, similarly, it's natural to have anxiety about how you're perceived because winning the esteem of people seems to have helped get genes into the next generation during human evolution. But then in the modern environment, you put people in situations like this, they're addressing a bunch of people they've never met, and naturally people have public speaking anxieties, and they imagine crazy things. There are people who are recurringly imagine that they will projectile vomit while doing public speaking, even though they've never done it. And they believe it when they're having the fear. And so you got two problems. We were built to sometimes suffer and not see things clearly. The modern environment in some ways makes things worse. It makes us, imagine things that aren't going to happen or are very unlikely to happen and so on. So I fear that in talking about anxiety and stress, I'm again making meditation sound like a purely therapeutic thing. And I want to emphasize that I do think there's a lot more to it than that. In the book, I focus a lot on two of the deepest and pretty central concepts in Buddhism, I would say. One is called not self, the idea that the self is in some sense an illusion, and the other is called emptiness, which has a number of interpretations, but it's sometimes put as the things you see do not have inherent existence, or they don't have essences, or something like that. And so both things sound pretty arcane if you hear them for the first time, and I'm not going to have time to get into them deeply here. I would say, though, just quickly about not self, a point I try to emphasize in the book is that when you do something that is fairly common in mindfulness meditation, which is just get a different vantage point on your feelings, such as the one I just described, or even less dramatic than what I just described, but just suddenly you have a little perspective on a feeling that previously you might have been barely aware of, but you would have kind of slavishly obeyed, right? And you get enough perspective on the feeling so that they're no longer in charge, and you may even exercise some choice in whether you follow their guidance. Well, I would say that when you do something like that, you are making an incremental step toward not self, toward the experience of not self. And I look at the Buddha's own early teachings on the subject, and I think you can interpret them very much in that spirit, the kind of original, so-called first discourse on not self. Now, as for emptiness, let me just kind of close on that and, well, talk about emptiness and then get back to this question of contemporary politics, and then open it up for Q&A. So I had an experience on my very first meditation retreat, and I talk about this in the book, but I was taking a walk through the woods, and I saw a particular weed called a plantain weed. And it was a kind of weed that had infested my lawn for years and years. And I'd spent a lot of time trying to pull it up, trying to kill it. And all of a sudden, I just couldn't understand why. I looked at the weed and I thought, this weed is just as beautiful as all the other stuff that we're not calling weeds. You know, there's no objective criterion for distinguishing weeds from not. It's just some person at some point decided to call certain things weeds, and so we all do. But the feeling at that time was that it didn't make sense. And it wasn't just a kind of a logical conclusion I reached. It was a perceptual shift. You know, when we look at things we consider weeds, we sense a kind of essence of weed. And it's a subtle thing, but it's very much informed by feeling. I would say it's not just kind of cognitive. It's not just perceptual. It's very much infused by feeling. And by the way, I would say one thing in general that I think Buddhist psychology has been very prescient in is the emphasis on the way feelings subtly infiltrate what we think of as cognition and shape our thoughts and cling and attach themselves to our thoughts. And so on. But in any event, I didn't see essence of weed, and suddenly it was beautiful. All the greenery was beautiful. And by the way, if you talk to people who seem to walk around with the so-called experience of emptiness, they say the same thing. They say things project their identities less sharply than they used to. That just seems like a little less. They know it's a clock if they look at that, but it's like it's got less clock vibe than it used to. But they also say everything is beautiful, or they may say everything has a positive energy or something. So this brings us back to contemporary politics, in particular the psychology of tribalism, which I think is the big problem with the world. Wherever the conflict is, sectarian conflict, ideological polarization in America, national conflict, wherever you see conflict, I think the problem is what I would call the psychology of tribalism, somewhat misleading term, but in any event, it's I would say, a set of cognitive biases that lead us to, well, involve identifying with one group and affect the way you process information relevant to your relations with the other group. And I think one good thing about mindfulness meditation is it makes you a little more aware of how your feelings trigger certain biases. So a good example is the so-called fake news, right? And now I personally think almost all of us have spread fake news. I know I have. There have been times when I retweeted something without going back and examining the original source, and I later realized it had been misleading. And if you ask, what is it that leads somebody to do that? It's a feeling. It feels good to spread information that is unflattering to the group you don't like, or flattering to the group you like, or confirms the argument you've already made. You know, this is sometimes called confirmation bias, evidence consistent with your pre-existing view. I just want to emphasize, it's not just a cognitive bias. There is a feeling associated with it. I think mindfulness meditation can make you more aware that that's happening and lead you to kind of pause and reflect before sharing the fake news. Now, to get back to the essence thing and emptiness, I think the most consequential arena for emptiness and for not seeing essence of is the human realm. Because we do, and again, I think this is a product of natural selection, we do tend to see, you know, essence of rival, essence of enemy, essence of friend, essence of ally. And these perceptions shape the way we process information about them. And there's one particular cognitive bias that hasn't been discussed as much as I think it needs to be, and I want to just mention that quickly. So this is called attribution error. The original version of this was called the fundamental attribution error. And the idea originally, as it was originally studied, was when we try to explain somebody's behavior, why they did something, we attribute too much significance to the kind of person they are, kind of essence you might say, and not enough to circumstance. So if somebody in front of you in the checkout line is a jerk, is a rude to the clerk, you go, well, that's a jerk. That's essence of jerk. But when for all you know, they just had a bad night. I was actually a little rude last night. My flight from New Jersey was 8 hours late. And so I was just not in the mood to find that they did not have any rental cars for me. I mean, I kept it fairly well under control, but I like to think that wasn't the real me. Anyway, psychologists have found that they originally found that there was this bias toward, you might say essence, attributing things to a person's disposition rather than to situation. But then they found that it's actually subtler than that. And this is the interesting part. With our friends and allies, if they do something good, attribute that to their disposition, to the kind of person they are, to their essence. That's the kind of person they are. They do good things. If they do something bad, we have a situational explanation. They didn't get enough sleep, like me last night, or they were under stress, they just got horrible news about their family, whatever. With our enemies and rivals, it's the opposite. If they do something bad, it confirms our view of what their essence is. That's the kind of person they are. If they do something good, we explain it away. They just succumb to peer group pressure, or they're showing off, or whatever. This is hugely consequential. Like, you may have noticed that when we're, ramping up for a war, people who favor the invasion go to great lengths to paint the leader of the country we might invade as demonically as possible. Sometimes these people don't need much help. Sometimes they're bad people. But the point is that if you favor invasion, it makes sense to put them in that enemy's box, because once they're there, it's very hard to get out. But anything good they do will be explained away. Anything bad they do will confirm the initial image. And I think the same thing plays out in our politics. So, I think just a great contribution mindfulness meditation can make here is to make us more aware of the feelings that trigger various cognitive biases, that get us to retweet things or share them on Facebook without checking them, that get us to think unfairly unflattering things about people. And to get back to natural selection, I think to become aware of your feelings and decide whether or not to do their bidding is almost to launch a kind of rebellion against natural selection, because feelings are just the key levers that are used to kind of get us to follow what you might call natural selection's agenda. And parts of natural selection's agenda are great. It built a lot of things in here into us that I'm grateful for. Love, well, gratitude itself, speaking of being grateful. There's a lot of nice things. But I think, we have the power to look up the process that built us, decide whether we want to follow its dictates, and I think meditation can be a big help here. Just want to quickly say two things. And one is just a bit of promotion. I started a site called mindfulresistance.net. Only started it a few weeks ago. Right now we're just putting out a weekly newsletter. Of course, the term resistance has become associated with resistance against Trump, and I have to admit, I'm not a fan of Trump. But I mean resistance a little more broadly and deeply. I mean fighting the forces that gave rise to the mess we're in, which certainly includes the psychology of tribalism, and also includes a lot of social and political things, figuring out how to respond to challenges posed by globalization, technology, and so on. But my own feeling is that a lot of opponents of Trump overreact to him in ways that actually play into his hands. That's kind of an aside, but in general, I think that whatever fight you're fighting it mindfully is just good strategy, and not getting too sucked into reacting to things. So that's mindfulresistance.net. Final thing, and I should admit before I say this, I am prone to apocalyptic thinking, so you should discount this accordingly. But I think you could make the case that we are at a point in history where the only alternative to much deeper chaos and strife is for people to become more aware of how their minds work and seize some control, some conscious control of that process. Meditation isn't the only way to do that. Now, in my experience, it's the most effective, but there are various ways to become, including just reading about cognitive biases. There are a lot of ways to get at what you might call metacognition, but I think we may need something like a metacognitive revolution if the planet is going to do what it is poised to do, which is kind of cross the threshold to form a cohesive global community, as opposed to just collapsing back into chaos, which I think is a real possibility given some of the forces I see at work and some of the kind of positive feedback loops that are at work. But, I think one way or another, people need very much to get clearer on how their minds are distorting their perception of reality and warping their judgment of others and their treatment of others. And if, as Buddhism suggests, that makes them not just better people but happier people, well, that's a nice bonus. Thank you.
So we have time for Q&A. Anybody with a question?
I have a question here. So you just mentioned the political situation here in the U.S. I'm wondering, so sounds like a lot of people are having probably they're having a lot of illusions over the other side. Probably that's causing a lot of conflicts. I wonder if there's a way for them to calm down and really have a meaningful discussion instead of fighting into each other. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's so... That reminds me of another thing that I think is, I consider a cognitive bias that doesn't get discussed much in these terms, and it's this. It's that, and I think this may be built in by natural selection, built into the mind, but that's conjecture. But you may have noticed that if you try to explain why someone who did something bad did the thing, somebody will immediately say, oh, so you're saying it's not their fault? You're saying they're not to blame? Or, well, to take a, I won't get into the recent example, it's too highly charged. But if you try to explain, like, why do people join ISIS? It's like, oh, you're saying the terrorists aren't to blame? And this is an example of an impediment to what you're talking about, which is sitting down and just trying to understand, if you're anti-Trump, why people voted for Trump. I have 3 siblings who voted for Trump out of 4 siblings, so it's 3 to 2 if you count me, and it's hard because I'm so angry. But this is the biggest challenge we face. I mean. And I have I'll do another plug. I have a platform called Blogging Heads TV where we try to do a better job than many platforms do of hearing the other side. I've had a number of Trump supporters on and talked to them. But it's hard. And that's why I say I have some hope that just mindfulness meditation, if it continues to spread, will play a positive role. And I want to emphasize one thing. One thing people say is, wait a second, if our side meditates and we're calm, they'll just run us over, right? I mean, no, I think unilateral disarmament in this context works, okay? Because I think, to get back to Trump, I think a lot of times when people aren't calm and reacting to him, that's what he wants. That's playing into his hands because it's feeding his narrative that everyone hates him. That's what, that narrative appeals to his base. And that's just one example of how, in general, I think with these kinds of conflict, now obviously if it's an armed conflict and you literally surrender your weapons and they come kill you, that is not good strategy. But I think in this realm we're talking about, just deep political polarization, I think that progress on one side, on either side, can set in motion forces that will lead to a kind of a calming effect on the other side, and it can be a virtuous cycle. But this is a huge challenge.
So to ask questions, please line up back here. I guess that works out better for the AV if we just line up and ask. Thank you.
So you started to touch on this with the political resistance, but so like if someone who's skilled in meditation has a toothache, maybe they can contemplate the pain and behold it and view it with distance. But at what point should they just go to the dentist? And sort of where does the desire for contentment with your situation end, and when you should start to think about making a change? Why don't we just, could we just sit passively and tolerate the administration because we're very good at dissociating?
Yeah. The toothache thing I actually did, and I describe it in the book. I was on a retreat and I developed an abscessed tooth. And like when I drank any liquid, it was excruciatingly painful. So I meditated for half an hour just as an experiment, and then had a lot of it. And it was a surprising thing. I don't mean it took all the pain out of it, but it kind of vacillated between acute pain and like just going, whoa, that's an amazing wave of pain. And when I did that, it didn't hurt. It was really surprising, but I know that's not your question. Well, the question is with actual teeth. The answer is you should go to the dentist. But I think the main context for your question is, well, you hear this a lot. Tell me if this is what you mean. Will meditation kind of end my passion for social justice or for change or for resistance against forces of oppression? And to be honest, I have seen people who had gone so far down the path that I think that had happened. I think it's very rare. I think for people like me, it is you care enough about certain issues that the challenge is to pursue them wisely and not get caught up in like your hatred of the people on the other side and so on. So that is, it's like a larger philosophical question associated with Buddhism of nihilism, which I won't get into. But it's an interesting in principle question. In my experience, in practice, it doesn't arise very often. But anyway, I would say if you get that far, that like if you're so good at insulating yourself from the world, which in a certain sense is part of what meditation is about, learning to get better at coping. If you get so good that you don't care, then I would say you've gone farther than I want to go. It doesn't happen often.
Thanks.
Well, it's not question. Could you explain, talk about more about the projects that you are working on right now, how they can really help the society? Thanks.
The mindful resistance thing?
Yeah, and then if you can talk about several other things, or the one that you are feeling most interesting about or meaningful about.
Yeah, okay, well, the mindful resistance, like I said, we started it a few weeks ago. URL's mindfulresistance.net. All we're doing right now is putting out a weekly newsletter, kind of summarizing events, and we're still finding our voice, but trying to do it in a different way than people in the resistance per se do it, and both not get caught up in reacting to every provocation, and also trying to convey what's going on in the minds of the other side, of people who support Trump, because a lot of times that doesn't come through. So because most people who oppose Trump don't watch Fox News, but I think it's illuminating to know that. Now, honestly, this is, I hope, just the primordial stage of this project, and that eventually we will actually try to get people mobilized to try to become more productive citizens in the way I've described. Try to actually make a point of not sharing news without checking it out, and not needlessly ridiculing people unless you're pretty sure it's going to be productive. There have been times in history where ridicule was important. But I would like to develop an actual program for applying mindfulness in the everyday English sense to participation in politics and public life by just regular citizens, because I think that's where it has to go. I mean, if you ask, well, why do various opinion leaders, people on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, why do they seem so incendiary in the way they talk? Because they get positive reinforcement for it. They get viewers, they get retweets. You know, ultimately, in that sense, the people are in charge. It's just that it takes a whole bunch of them to make a difference. You know, so in other words, I don't want to confine this to people who meditate. At the same time, I think meditation can be very helpful. And I do want to emphasize to people who don't meditate that, you know, mindfulness meditation, if you look at the term and the origin of the term and the choice of the word mindful to translate the Buddhist term sati and all of this stuff, you know, it's meant to, I mean, they may think of mindfulness as just like, whoa, stop and smell the roses, you know, or just like getting absorbed in yourself and like, oh, my feelings. But, you know, ultimately, mindfulness is about real clarity of vision. And in fact, so the person who chose mindfulness to translate the term sati, a British civil servant and scholar who went over to, I think, Burma and got engrossed in the culture, you know, he said that the Buddhist ideal of so-called right mindfulness, and this is one of the 8 factors in the Eightfold Path in Buddhism, is sati, mindfulness, what's been translated as mindfulness. He said it's just like a clear, alert mind. That is mindfulness. You know, not unswayed by like emotional reaction, just clear and alert. And I think that would be real progress.
You talked a lot about mindfulness's potential to overcome cognitive biases.
Mm-hmm.
And there seems to be a lot of literature about the problems with cognitive biases and that they do in fact exist. In the book, do you go over evidence that mindfulness can in fact overcome these cognitive biases? I'm aware of mindfulness reducing anxiety, increasing compassion, but in terms of seeing more clearly biases, is there
I'm
evidence
not
to that?
aware of studies that have been done. I mean, I know I gave a talk before the book came out at Rutgers, and a couple of people there made the suggestion that they should start working on that, you know, and actually study whether mindfulness. It's a fairly straightforward thing to study. You know, you have a control group and another group that meditates, and you give them cognitive bias tests at the beginning and the end. And so I don't know what's become of that. I'm not aware of. In fact, I'm not that aware of a lot of work on the role of feelings and emotions in triggering cognitive biases, but I feel very strongly, just intuitively and based on meditative introspection, that that's really fundamental, that it's all about feelings in terms of triggering them.
So how do you deal with like the conflicting experience between like really attributing like an error to somebody's character just because you don't know them clearly, where like the natural instinct of considering like the worst case scenario where like there might be something that's really wrong, or it might be just because you're not able to see it like really clearly and you don't know what exactly the person is or what exactly the
So you mean how in everyday life should you go about trying to figure out what the
like
issue is?
in general, like especially in a lot of cases when we deal with like a lot of people, we may not know exactly what the thing is, but one of the primitive natural instincts is like when something doesn't appear right, we tend to think like negatively and attribute like negative aspects to people or situations or groups. So how exactly like is suggestible to like deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the you know, I would advocate a stance of firm agnosticism. In other words, sometimes you just don't know. I mean, until you know more about the situation, you just don't know whether they regularly behave like this in all circumstances or they just had a bad day. So you reserve judgment. And, you know, this issue of judgment is like, you hear it a lot in the context of mindfulness. You know, it's like, don't make judgments, and, you know, sometimes people dismiss that like, what, are you, you know, you don't have values, you don't make moral judgments, and it's not that. It's just like, don't make judgments about stuff you don't know. And that's very hard because and I get into this in the book about how our brains seem designed to make really quick judgments. You know, presumably because, you know, if a quick judgment is right 51% of the time, then it's better than, from natural selection's point of view, in certain circumstances, it might be better than agnosticism, right? But that's not a good reason for, you know, for reaching quick.
In a lot of situations, it might be required for you to be able to like evaluate or like kind of come to a decision than just keeping it as like an abstract, vague understanding and just dragging it forever.
Well, do you have a specific kind of example in mind where you might have to?
For example, like I mean, I think my point like that I'm coming from is like there could be like a lot of people with like inherent biases as well, but then they actually have those biases because they actually believe in them. They
Yeah.
Whether intentionally or unintentionally, somehow like the brains get programmed because of the past experiences or whatever. But then like they may not be able to like really see the facts, but still need to make decisions, or like let's say whether they want to continue working with somebody or not, or whether they want to like really stay with someone or not, like, or
Yeah.
let's say like even like hiring someone or not, like things like that where
Yeah.
you can't like really indefinitely delay things.
Yeah, I mean, so you're talking about kind of like group stereotypes and biases,
Right.
like ethnic bias and so on. You know, I think some of the social science literature shows that what's most constructive is if you find yourself in a non-zero-sum situation with somebody in that group. In other words, you can benefit by, in some sense, doing business with them, or you know, it's in your interest to collaborate with them. You know, like I'm guessing, I don't fly business class, but I'm guessing you don't see a lot of expressions of bigotry, because for one thing, you've got these different ethnic groups doing business with one another, right? I mean, it pays to be polite in a situation like that. There's a lot of evidence of that. And I think homosexuality is an interesting case, because if you ask why values changed so fast toward acceptance of homosexuality, that was an interesting case where a lot of people knew gay people, they just didn't know they were gay. And once gay people started coming out of the closet, then more people started coming out, and more people started coming out, and pretty soon everyone had a cousin or a friend. And so, you know, when you're in that kind of relationship with someone, you're just more inclined to be tolerant. And the challenge is when there aren't enough of those kinds of relationships, you know, between two groups. And once it's torn apart, it's hard to reassemble. You know, Sunni and Shia in Iraq used to get together a lot better than they did before the war, before we invaded. And so, I don't know.
Okay, so I'm asking this question on behalf of a group of Googlers. We had this email thread about this topic. So recently there has been a lot of effort into secularizing Buddhism, right?
Right.
So there's a lot of focus on meditation and mindfulness, but then we leave out the core aspects of Buddhism like reincarnation and cause and effect. So in Buddhism, there are two concepts to explain everything, right? Like the relative truth and the ultimate truth, right? As a Buddhist myself, in ultimate truth, I don't believe in reincarnation. I don't believe in cause and effect. There's no self, right? But in relative truth, for me, not believing in reincarnation is like, I don't believe in time. So for, you know, if you consider yourself Buddhist, and why not explain things like
We should say that by
in those two concepts, like
Right.
in the relative truth and in the ultimate truth.
So by cause and effect, you probably mean what's commonly called karma, right?
Correct.
Right. So,
Yeah,
so
I mean, these topics are
yeah.
considered
I
esoteric.
mean, I say that because just
right?
quickly, one thing that's not appreciated by Buddhism is that karma aside, it really puts a lot of emphasis on cause and effect in the scientific side. In a sense, at least as much as Western science does. If you really look at what is meant by, well, the rationales for both not self and emptiness turn out to involve a really pervasive appreciation of the pervasiveness of causal influence. But that aside, first of all, I actually, and I say this in the book, I actually don't call myself Buddhist because, I mean, I am doing mindfulness meditation. I'm doing it in the explicit context of Buddhist philosophy. And in the book, I defend the fundamental ideas of Buddha, some of the fundamental ideas, not self-emptiness and so on. But I just worry that to Buddhists who are Buddhists in the religious sense, it might, I don't know, it might seem disrespectful or something for me to show up and say, well, I buy the philosophy and the psychology, so I'm going to call myself a Buddhist. I don't know. I feel a little awkward about that. I think it's fine for people who are doing so-called Western Buddhism or secular Buddhism to call themselves Buddhists. I actually don't, because I'm not. I don't get into karma, reincarnation, and so on at all, and it's not part of my practice or my belief. Is that at all responsive?
Yeah. I mean, I have read that, some Buddhist, hardcore Buddhists, they say that, dilution of Buddhism, what's happening in the West, is actually a big threat to this 2500 tradition, right?
Yeah. I mean, in my experience, my previous book was called The Evolution of God. It was about the Abrahamic religions. And one thing you notice is just spiritual traditions evolve forever, and they branch off. I mean, look at how many different kinds of Buddhism there are, right? I mean, and there are some non-trivial differences of doctrine within. That's one problem some people have with why Buddhism is true. There's no one Buddhism. And that's why I focused on kind of, pretty core concepts like not self. But, so that's one thing you can say is that, like, I mean, in a certain sense, every version of every religion is threatened by its own future evolution in a certain sense. In fact, which quickly, I mean, one thing that's characteristic of Western Buddhism is meditation. Westerners think that Buddhists are people who meditate and don't believe in God. Well, in Asia, that's the opposite of the truth. They do believe not in a single creator God, but in deities, and they don't meditate by and large. Lay people don't meditate in Asia. But actually, the tradition...
That's the lay people you're talking about.
The lay people, right. But what I was going to say was, even there, in Burma in the late 19th century, in reaction to colonial occupation, they did establish a big lay meditation tradition. And a lot of Western, kind of Theravada, Vipassana Buddhism traces its lineage to that. So in a certain sense, this feature of so-called Western Buddhism has roots in, Asian Buddhism as it evolved in response to forces 100 and 140 years ago. So I mean, so I both, on the one hand, I definitely respect the view that Western Buddhists should not call themselves Buddhists, and that's why I don't call myself one. But at the same time, well, I guess I certainly, another way to look at it is, isn't, first of all, isn't there something valuable about what's happening in the West, A, and B, don't you think, I think it's richer if informed by Buddhist philosophy than if not. And, in a way this gets into the whole issue of cultural appropriation and so on, which is above my pay grade. But
you have a question on the mindfulness meditation potential in terms of introducing that early in life. I think many of us have accessed some of these tools later in life than we would have hoped, and it seems like there's a lot of potential to offset some of the negative aspects that are just fundamental to our nature in terms of the tribalism and the biases that we kind of we absorb over time. What are your thoughts on the potential to introduce these tools maybe earlier in life?
I'm all for it.
Are you seeing any trends?
I'm all for it. And this is, interestingly, this gets to the question of Buddhism as a label. Because if you talk to people who are trying to introduce mindfulness meditation in the public schools, a lot of them will say it's a lot easier if they don't use the word Buddhism, just as a political matter. Like, we have one congressman, so far as I know, who is into mindfulness meditation, Tim Ryan, and he has found in talking to his constituents and so on, he needs to emphasize that this is not at odds. The part of Buddhism he's talking about is not at odds with, any existing religious heritage these people may have, and I think he's by and large not using the term Buddhism. The people who are, there's like a mindful magazine or something. I think so, mindful, and they don't want to talk about Buddhism because they're introducing meditation into institutional settings, corporate settings, and so on. So to some extent, that divorce from the label is going to happen as part of the quest to more deeply ingrain our society with meditation. And maybe it's a worthwhile trade-off, I don't know, but I'm certainly in favor of starting people young.
So our modern environment has produced conditions in everyday life that are not conducive to sustained focus and attention. What are some of the consequences of our fractured attention spans? And does current science provide any insight?
Well, you're asking the right person. I've always had attention problems. I never emerged from a college lecture with a coherent set of notes. I really did. And I tried. I really did. I just couldn't do it. One thing, I get into this a little in the book, and the point is just that, again, as is so often the case, attention problems are largely, I think, problems of affect, of feeling. If you pay attention, like if I'm trying to do some writing, and I suddenly switch over and check my Twitter feed, or get back to researching some smartphone I'm going to buy, if you look at what's actually happening, first, I've reached a point in the writing where it's not coming easily, and that makes me feel uneasy and uncomfortable. That's a bad feeling. Something pops in my mind, like researching smartphones, checking my Twitter feed, that gives me a good feeling, and it's that simple. Attention is very much an affective issue, I think. Now, the problem's gotten worse because there are so many people on the internet trying to get you addicted to things. And the other thing I'd say is I think one reason meditation retreats seem to be growing in appeal is because one thing they do, set aside the meditation, they can just get you off the grid. And by the way, if you go to a meditation retreat, I strongly recommend you put your email on auto reply, leave your smartphone at home or whatever, just get totally absorbed, no news from the outside world. That, for my money, is a way to do a meditation retreat. And I just think that so amplifies the beneficial effects of the meditation itself. And it's a good reminder. Of course, in the end, you have to go back to the real world, and this is, of course, the problem with meditation retreats in general. They end, and then it's everything that came easily by the end of the retreat is harder. But it's still a good reminder of how much. If a retreat goes well, they usually do, in my experience. By the end of the retreat, your state of mind is so different. It's just a reminder of how, in everyday life, your mind is just pushed and pulled increasingly by, by electronic things. Some of you are probably young enough you don't really totally remember the pre-internet world. Believe me, it was different.
Okay, again, we'd like to thank Robert Wright for coming here today. And,
well, thank you for having me.
Engaging us in this very interesting discussion.
This was really great.
Once again, thank you.
Thank you.